So, you're thinking about doing a PhD in philosophy. I'm going to make a couple assumptions here. I'm going to talk as if you have made up your mind about applying to a PhD program. You can't be talked out of it. You're committed. Second, I'm going to assume that the main reason that you're applying to a PhD program in philosophy is that you want to teach at the college level. Now, of course, there are plenty of philosophy PhDs who end up doing something other than teaching for their career. But a good amount of people who apply to a PhD program want to go on to teach philosophy at the college level. I'm also going to be speaking about US programs. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of someone who went through a US philosophy program, PhD program. UK schools, other schools in other countries, they're going to do some of these things differently than the way that I described. Okay, with that in mind, first thing, when you apply to a philosophy PhD program, you want to think about it as applying to a person, not just applying to a school. You're going to be applying to work with a person, maybe a couple different people, on your dissertation. You're going to be working with this person on the process of writing something publishable, typically in an academic philosophy journal. You're going to be working with this person on the process of getting yourself out there on the job market. And you're going to be working with this person on so many other things that I can mention. When you're considering which schools to apply to, of course, you should consider the quality of the school that you're applying to. And in the description below to this video, I'll include a link to an unofficial ranking system for philosophy programs. But what you're really going to be applying to is a person, a potential supervisor that oversees ideally almost every aspect of your academic life. And this is really important. There are so many philosophy PhD applicants who don't really understand this important aspect going into the process. I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are interested in working on the topic of free will. If you apply to a school where no philosopher on faculty there is working on that topic, your chances of being admitted to that school are much, much lower. You want to apply to a school where at least one faculty member is currently working on your area of interest that you want to be working on too. In fact, I would suggest that you get in touch personally, typically through email, with a faculty member from the department that you want to apply to before you even start the application process for that school. Why do I say this? Well, when I applied to PhD programs, I actually emailed a faculty member at a department that I was interested in applying to. This was before I even started the application process to that department and to that school. His response was that even though there were some philosophers who in that department were working on topics within my general area that I was interested in, there was no faculty member there who was working on the specific thing that I was interested in. So he told me it probably wouldn't be worth applying. I actually appreciated that so much. It saved me so much time, so much disappointment, because I probably would have been rejected from that program. And so you want to correspond in some way, if you can, with a particular individual from the department that you want to apply to before even going through the application process, so you know what you're getting into ahead of time. If you can, you also want to get a feel of your potential supervisor's personality, their schedule, their communication preferences, their response time to communication, those sorts of things. I'll come back to this. You should also only apply to schools where the program is funded, where they are funding you getting a PhD. They pay you to get a PhD. That will probably seem obvious to some, and for some, it might seem like a surprise. But good philosophy programs that are worth your time are going to be funded by the department and the institution. The department gets money from the institution to admit some number of graduate students. And they do this in exchange for a, let's be honest, very small stipend, which is not a salary. So in exchange for receiving a very modest small amount in the form of a stipend, you are going to be a teaching assistant. And eventually you'll teach your own courses. And in some cases, you'll be like a research assistant or something. And even with funded programs, there's a good chance that you'll come out of the program with some debt. And unless you were accepted to a top 10 to 15 program, something like that, the chance of you getting a job right out of the program that's well paying is close to zero. So you don't want to make your financial situation worse by getting accepted and going to a program where you have to pay in order to complete the program. Now, many people ask, how many schools should you apply to? My answer to that is however many application fees you can afford for however many potential supervisors you think will want to work with you long term. There's more to say on that, but there is plenty of advice online about school choice, and I'll link to a couple resources in the description below. All right, so once you have narrowed down your potential supervisors and the schools that you want to apply to, how should you think about the application process? This may sound obvious, but you want to focus almost every bit of your attention on the writing aspects of the application. Every word that you put in the application needs to be intentional. Of course, make everything look nice and professional, but put every ounce of your mental energy into crafting and editing your writing for precision, for clarity, and for impact. You want to read over your written pieces and think to yourself, when potential supervisor X, whoever that is, reads what I've written here, they will want to work with me for 10 years or more. I'll explain the 10 years part later. Your writing sample in particular should be as tight as you can possibly make it. The PhD program is not the place to learn the most basic fundamentals of philosophical writing, creating a tight thesis, pitching and motivating your main idea, structuring the paper around a clear, tight argument, defining your terms when they're introduced, summarizing your conclusion at the end, those sorts of things. Think about the work that your supervisor wants to do that sounds appealing to them. They don't get paid more for taking on a supervisory role. What they want to do, typically, is to help you create original work, to advance an idea, to fill a gap in the literature, to build a complex argument that they're also interested in. What they don't want to do is slog through teaching someone the basics of writing. What you might want to do is compare the structure of your writing, of your sample paper, to, let's say, 7 or more examples of papers from top quality philosophy journals. I'll include a link to some of the best journals out there, philosophy journals, in the description below. So take a look at each of those papers from all those journals and ask yourself, how are they organizing their paper? How are they ordering the ideas in their paper? And how does that compare to what you're doing in your paper? You want to take the best structure from those papers and then apply it to your particular writing sample, your paper. The other parts of the application packet are pretty straightforward. You have the main application with all your basic info. You will typically include 3 letters of reference from professors that you've already had who say great things about you and particularly your work. You'll also want to ask those professors that you ask for a reference to review your writing that you include in the application before you send it out to schools. You'll include transcripts from wherever you've gone to school. You will include a CV, which at this point, it's not going to be that impressive. That's okay. That's what you're about to build. You'll include a statement of intent or a statement of purpose. This is about what you intend to study, work on, and what are your goals, those sorts of things. And for many schools now, the GRE is not required. It's optional. For some, it's going to be required, but you'll want to take a look and see which schools require the GRE and which schools don't. Once you submit the full application, usually around December or January to be admitted in the fall, now you're going to enter the waiting period. Do yourself a favor and try to get as psychologically prepared as you can for this period. For each school you apply to, you'll either get rejected or accepted, or you might get put on a waiting list. I've experienced all 3. The rejections, at least for me, were tough. You usually get a stock email And typically when you receive that, you wonder to yourself, what could you have done better? Could your writing have been better? What if you phrase this way? That's natural to think about those things. But again, do yourself a favor and try to leave all those questions aside. If you do get put on the waiting list, here's how it works. The philosophy program that you apply to appoints a graduate admissions committee from their philosophy faculty, and then they admit some number of students for that year. And that can change from year to year. Sometimes it doesn't, but it can change from year to year. If one of the committee's admitted applicants also got put on a waiting list, maybe they applied to their dream school and they got put on their waiting list to their dream school and they were accepted in the program that you're applying to, that can lead to a causal chain that's going to affect you too. They're going to be waiting to make a final decision until they've heard everything from all the schools they're interested in. So there's a lot of waiting up until April 15th. That's the day that everyone needs to decide, including the schools, both the schools and the applicants. I remember being put on 2 waiting lists, and the graduate coordinator for each school would be emailing all the waiting list applicants, including me. I remember for one of the schools that I was put on the waiting list, the committee went down the list of their choices, and a few of these waiting list applicants rejected my school's acceptance and went to another school. So at some point I was told I was next in line, and if the person ahead of me rejected their offer and went to another school, then I would be admitted. So I waited all day. Then I got the news. The person who was one ahead of me accepted my school's offer. So I got rejected. Waiting over. Then I got the news from the other school, my second school that I was on the waiting list for. Their admissions process was now closed and they had chosen their PhD cohort. I got rejected again. That was it. I got accepted into a master's program when their PhD program rejected me, but that master's program wasn't funded. All the PhD programs I applied to rejected me. So April 15th can be a tough day. Fortunately, after that, I gathered myself after feeling pretty low for a little bit, and I polished and improved my application packet, and I was accepted the next year from the school, one of the schools that waitlisted me. I still remember everything about getting that call from my not yet supervisor, my eventual supervisor at the time. He told me I was accepted into the program, and in that moment, it was one of the best feelings of my whole life. Okay, so if you pass through all of that and you end up actually getting accepted into a PhD program in philosophy, what can you expect? In my view, the biggest challenges you will face as a PhD student will be psychological and social, not intellectual. Now, of course, the academic work is going to be very difficult, the hardest you've ever done. But typically the person who has made it that far in the application process, going through all of these challenges, actually enjoys working on the intellectual, difficult philosophical challenges that come from academic work in philosophy. And those who don't enjoy that kind of work are going to be filtered out pretty quickly. But before I get to the non-academic struggles, let me just say a couple things about the academic challenges as well. Typically, you're going to have some amount of coursework, sometimes 2 years worth, give or take. You take seminars on somewhat specialized topics with a small number of other graduate students, and the topics are going to be on something like metaethics or modal metaphysics or continental philosophy of language. And you'll probably also take a course, or maybe more, in formal deductive mathematical logic. Now, your coursework is where you want to really fine-tune your paper writing skills. You want to become razor sharp, get dialed into the basic structure of a philosophy paper. You want to motivate the problem that you're working on to someone who doesn't work in your area. For example, if you work in ethics, you want to convince someone who works in epistemology or metaphysics or philosophy of mind why they should care about your paper. You want to be able to state your clear, tight thesis in a sentence, maybe 2. You want to locate your thesis within the broader literature on the topic that you're working on. You want to define any terms that you introduce in the paper. You want to clearly state any assumptions that you're making. You want to highlight the structure of the argument that you're making. You want to be explicit about that. You'll also want to reintroduce what you have done in the paper so far every time you begin a section and what you're about to do. You want to give basically a roadmap for what your paper is about and the structure. Guide them through every piece. You're not writing a mystery novel. You don't want them to wonder where this is going. At some points, it might even feel repetitive, but the reader's going to appreciate being reminded. They don't have the topic and the structure in their head like you do. So reminders along the way, signposts, is a really good practice. And then at the end, you want to clearly state your conclusion. So you want to use the papers that you write in your seminars for trial runs for your dissertation. Or best case scenario, maybe they do turn into chapters in your dissertation. Or maybe you take that paper and you submit it to a good academic journal of philosophy, and you get some good comments from peers from other philosophy faculty who are outside of your institution. Because once you're finished with coursework, it's time to really get working on that dissertation, sending chapters to your supervisor and maybe also your committee once you form that. All right, there's a lot more to say about the academic side of being a graduate student in a philosophy PhD program. But let me tell you a few things about the non-academic side of being in a philosophy PhD program. You might not have anyone telling you this before you enter the program and before you apply to the program. You might not even have someone telling you this as you begin the academic program. Hopefully you do, but I was surprised at how many people didn't know what I'm about to tell you. The typical PhD student is going to struggle financially. The stipend that you get from the PhD program is going to be very, very low. And here's the kicker. The department, the program, the institution will more than likely prevent you from working anywhere else to make up for the very low stipend that you're getting from the department. So typically, you are not allowed to take on a second job to support yourself. Why is that? Well, the schools reason something like this. If you take on a second job, that's going to jeopardize you and your work and the odds of you completing and finishing the PhD program. So on average, you're going to be stuck earning somewhere between $15,000 to $25,000, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, over the course of 9 months. Typically, that just lasts 9 months, and you don't earn anything over the summer months. Sometimes there are ways to do that, but typically the stipend is going to be for a 9-month period, and then you're on your own for the summer. You also need to think about getting your whole life to that school. Before you step foot on campus, you will probably need to move far away to an institution. And the cost of moving can sometimes be very expensive, especially if you have a family that's moving with you. So covering those moving costs, just getting there to be in the program, can often be really expensive and a major challenge before you even start the program. Remember, you probably won't see any money in your bank account until a month or so after you arrive. So for the average person, if you can cover those moving expenses, you're going to have almost no income to speak of throughout your entire time of being a graduate student. You're going to be close to the poverty line even if you're single. It is extremely challenging to cover just your basic living expenses if that stipend is your only source of income, even if you're single. And it's impossible to do that if you have a family and kids. The math just doesn't add up if you're relying just on a graduate program stipend for your entire income. That means you're going to need to supplement that stipend in some way. Now, you can do that through summer teaching or some other opportunity in the summer work of some kind. You can do that, for example, if your spouse finds a job that pays enough to cover expenses. You could possibly do that if you have financial support from other people's generosity, like maybe family or a benefactor of some kind. You can do that through loans or all of the above that I've mentioned. I'm sure there are other things that I haven't mentioned. Now, aside from the loans that are going to put you in debt, those financial supplements can be really difficult to find. And they're especially difficult to find if you're counting on them to last the 5 to 7 years, sometimes more, that you are going to be in the program. If you have kids and your spouse work, that's going to present other kinds of challenges to graduate life in general too. If you do want to be successful in the program, it's going to be very difficult to do the intense work that success in the program demands, while also taking care of your kids for long stretches, periods of time while you're in the program. So the psychological challenges of the financial strain that you experience throughout the entire program, they are real and they are constant. You're doing all this academic work in relative social isolation for a good amount of the time that you're in the program. All the while you're thinking to yourself, there's a really good chance that all of this hard work is going to have no payoff at the end because of the difficulty of finding a job when you come out of a an. I'll give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. While I was looking at job listings in my field, I noticed that Mississippi State had an opening in their department, a job opening in their department, in the philosophy department. While I was looking at job listings in my field, shortly before I ended the program, I noticed that Mississippi State University had a job opening to teach in their philosophy department. This was a temporary position. It only lasted 9 months, which was the academic year, and it paid $36,000 for those 9 months. And believe it or not, a job like that gets tons of PhDs applying to that position. Now, Mississippi State is an R1 institution with a ton of financial resources that they have access to. At the time I looked, the average annual public school teacher salary in Mississippi was $48,000. So if I was lucky enough to get this position at Mississippi State after grinding through years and years of hard work in the PhD program, I would basically be earning as much as a public school teacher in the state of Mississippi when you account for the Mississippi State entire annual salary for a public school teacher and the 9-month stipend really that I would get for that temporary position at Mississippi State. But even if I got that position, I would not have the stability of long-term employment. It would be done after 9 months. So that means I would have to start applying for my next job on day one of teaching at MSU. When you start looking at job listings, you start to realize the very low value, unfortunately, of what you do as a philosophy PhD. All those years of hard work are really not that valued, comparatively speaking. That realization can be very psychologically difficult, especially if you have sacrificed so much over those years, and maybe the people around you have sacrificed as well, so that you can earn that PhD. So aside from the real financial costs, social isolation is a real cost too. To state the obvious, a philosophy PhD demands a ton of research, very intense reading, and very intense writing. And it demands a lot of teaching from you as well, ideally. But the intense level of research you need to do to be successful, typically it's going to require a long-term isolated space where you can do your work free from a lot of interruptions and distractions. It's possible that your campus office might be quiet at times, but even that space can be pretty socially distracting if there are other people around, and especially if your office mate is there. But let's say you are successful and you find some physical space that is free of distractions. The nature of PhD research in general, at least in philosophy, requires you to do about 95% of it alone. You read stuff alone, and then you write stuff alone. That's research. The typical PhD student has to shut out the rest of the world, including friends and family, for a good chunk of the day, even on weekends, and they have to do this for years and years. And that kind of daily, long-term isolation is the norm. And it's necessary for most PhD students to churn out the level of writing that they need to do in order to be successful in the program and afterwards. But that constant isolation is likely going to have some short-term and long-term effects on your psychology and your social life. The program is going to cost you more than just financially. And being a PhD student makes you especially vulnerable. Like all jobs, when you're in the program, you have to navigate all kinds of personalities. And let's face it, philosophy personalities are unique. I have met some truly remarkable people in the philosophy profession, but I've also met some who are uniquely horrendous in the way that they treat other people who they think are below them. So how do you navigate this vulnerability throughout the program? Well, other PhD students, other graduate students will probably be a source of strength and community for you, and might even keep you sane throughout the program. I'm sure there are horror stories of some grad student in the program making everyone's lives miserable, but those kinds of stories, at least just in my own experience, seem to be more rare. And typically, other graduate students have no official power or authority over you, but your professors, and especially your supervisor and your committee, have basically complete power over you. And when I say they have complete power over you, I mean they have complete power. Someone on faculty can give you a really bad grade in a seminar if they disagree with your political position, and their job will still be secure. I had this happen to me. Faculty member can join your dissertation committee and then ghost you and never respond to any email that you send, and their job will still be secure. I had that happen to me too. They can ask to be on your dissertation committee and then refuse to give you any feedback on your chapters and your work. And then in your dissertation defense, which is the most important moment of your entire PhD program, of that entire 5 to 7 years or so, they can show up and then try to sabotage your defense, and their job is going to be still secure. Yeah, I had that happen too. Or it's possible that your main supervisor leaves your school in the middle of your program for a better position at another school, which is understandable. I had that happen too. Because of all this and many other reasons, I just cannot emphasize enough the importance of the social chemistry that you need to have between you and your supervisor to give yourself a fighting chance at success in the program. The best case scenario is when they are motivated to work on what you're also interested in, what you're working on. And when both your schedules work and you can meet regularly to talk about what you're working on. You want your communication styles and your response times to align. You want someone who gives you useful and good critical feedback so they help you get better in your thinking and in your writing. But so many things can deviate from that best case scenario over the years that you spend in the program. Your success really depends on pleasing about 1 to 3 people through your writing and through your social interactions. Philosophers sometimes have unique habits, unique working styles, unique preferences that you can't always anticipate. Some supervisors take months to get back to you. And like I said before, some supervisors are unethically bad at communicating with whoever they're supervising. I can't emphasize this enough. Your success in a PhD program depends completely and entirely on your supervisor and your committee approving your work. If they don't work with you and they don't approve what you do, years and years will be completely wasted. Okay, but you need your supervisor and your committee members to not just pass and approve your dissertation, you also need them to say good things about you for years and years and years when you go on the job market, and even after, if somehow you miraculously manage to get a job. I'll explain. As all professors know, and as all PhD students eventually come to find out, the job market in philosophy and in other fields, but particularly philosophy, is completely depressing for everyone involved. When you start to learn how depressing the job market is, the ever-present, relentless time limit of the program that you're in starts haunting you basically from day one. In those last couple of years especially, you're going to feel the constant pressure of completing the dissertation, of course. But sometimes even more important is the intense, unavoidable pressure to get your papers accepted at academic philosophy conferences and to get your papers published in a good, solid, high quality academic philosophy journal before going on the job market. Generally speaking, if you don't publish at least one paper in a good, solid academic philosophy journal during grad school, you won't get a job. You probably won't get a full-time permanent academic job anyway, but an absence of publications on your CV more or less kills your chances of getting a job in mainstream academia. Now, there are some good, small liberal arts schools that don't care about your publication record when you go on the job market. And community colleges generally don't care whether you've published in grad school or not. But hiring committees for tenure track positions generally will care. So while you're likely having real financial troubles for years, you have mathematically very little chance of landing a job in your discipline after all those years of sacrifice. For some, this will seem obvious, but a school has to have an opening in the philosophy department and advertise it. And the position has to be specific to the particular subfield that you worked on while you were in grad school. For bigger institutions, you don't just apply to a philosophy position, you apply to a position where they are specific on your research interest. They are looking for someone who has done research and published in an area like metaphysics or philosophy of language or sometimes logic, and someone who is competent to teach either in that area or in a different area. If your particular interests, your specialization, your competency doesn't match with that job posting, typically you're just not even going to be considered for that position. And even if you check all those boxes, often there are dozens or even hundreds of people applying for that one position. The typical route to landing a job, if you're very lucky, I'm not exaggerating here, is to get one of those temporary 9-month positions at a school that is probably very far away from where you've studied for a few years. So you'll have to think about moving costs again. And if your luck streak continues, you just repeat that process at least a couple times over the next few years. You're going to be applying and moving from place to place year after year after year. New friends, new school, new colleagues. That process ends when either you get unlucky and you land no position for that year, or miraculously you get some more permanent teaching position. And that job cycle year after year can just be so indescribably difficult in so many ways. Financially, socially, psychologically, and in many cases those costs can be just too high to be worth whatever gains there might be from such a position. And remember, for each position that you apply to, each philosophy teaching position, maybe research position, whatever you apply to, you're going to need your supervisor and likely your committee to say a lot of good things about you. So the person who becomes your supervisor at the beginning of the program or at whatever point in the program you two decide to be related in that way, that relationship is going to last for years and years and years if you continue to want to stay in academia and get a job teaching philosophy somewhere. They are going to have to say good things about you to each place that you apply to. Okay, so let's step back. Obviously, there are so many jobs out there that require very difficult things psychologically, financially, socially. So there's a sense in which graduate life is not totally unique in that way. Part of what is unique about PhD work is that it really isn't a job in the ordinary sense of the word. And the fact that it isn't an ordinary job allows these billion-dollar endowment, in some cases, institutions to legally and in some cases try to ethically justify the extremely low pay that they give to their own PhD students. For myself, I wasn't doing a PhD as a vanity project. I was just trying to increase my opportunities long term. So I saw doing a PhD as an investment, but obviously in so many ways, that kind of thinking was a big mistake. The psychological toll of a PhD can't be reduced to just the constant social isolation or the intense pressure to publish throughout the program. It can't be reduced to the distance from family and friends or the poverty and financial struggles. It can't be reduced to the likely bleak future that will probably face you at the end of the program. The toll, at least for me, came from simultaneously experiencing all those things at once, all the time, for 5 or so years. My primary reason for making this video is to warn those who may be thinking about applying to a PhD program, particularly in philosophy. And I want to provide a window into the unique trials and challenges that come from experiencing what it's like to be in a PhD program, more the daily living experience than the academic challenges. I can say a lot more about the ways a PhD program is just unimaginably difficult, academically speaking, intellectually speaking. I was admittedly embarrassingly uninformed when I applied to the PhD programs that I applied to. I didn't have a solid grasp of the many pitfalls that are inherent in the system of getting a PhD at a major university. Now, a more balanced video might include a lot of positive aspects to getting a PhD in philosophy. I could mention the joys of teaching while I was in the program. I loved teaching almost every one of my classes while I was in a PhD program. I could mention the lifelong skills cultivated through hardcore mental, intellectual, academic training that I use every single day to this day and will for the rest of my life. And that's a great thing. But this is an intentionally imbalanced video. It's meant to put the fear into anyone looking to venture into the philosophy PhD world. I've personally experienced too many soul-crushing events and watched too many of my fellow grad students either drop from the program or suffer psychologically, socially, financially in all the ways that I've been describing. Not to emphasize these real aspects of PhD life. If you're considering doing a PhD, strongly consider something else, anything else. If you're not considering a PhD, but you know someone who's currently going through it, take a minute to give them any encouragement you can give them. It will be appreciated more than you think.